Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, wherever you may be. I know for you, Brian, it's 3:30 in the afternoon, beaming in here from the UK. My name is Adam Blackwell, the Vice President International at Development Services Group, and on behalf of the team at the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, that are known as GTAC, I'll be monitoring this session. I would like to thank all of you for joining in, and most importantly, our guest, Dr. Brian Phillips, for your willingness to present to us in your afternoon. Before I begin, I'd like to just apologize once again to everybody for the hiccup we had last week with Zoom. I am assured by our tech team and the folks at Zoom that it won't happen again. So hopefully we resolved and we're beyond that issue. As you know, this is a continuation of a series of talks by eminent people of the field of terrorism. And we're delighted that Dr. Brian Phillips has agreed to speak to us on how various groups are identified and designated as terrorist organizations. Dr. Brian Phillips is an associate professor in the Department of Government at the University of Essex in the UK. He's also an affiliated professor at the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics at CIDE in Mexico. I knew very well when I was posted there. He researches terrorism, civil conflict, organized crime, and related topics. He has published research on the U.S. Foreign Terrorism Organization List, the FTO List, and written or co-authored articles analyzing which types of groups end up on various countries' terrorist lists. And this year he co-authored a book, Insurgent Terrorism, Intergroup Relationships, and the Killing of Civilians, which was published by the Oxford University Press. Before starting his academic career, Dr. Phillips was a U.S. Marine. Please, as always, use the Q&A function in Zoom. We'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes for what I hope will be a robust and dynamic conversation. So again, please put your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. And Dr. Phillips, Brian, over to you.
Thanks so much, Adam, for that introduction and indeed the invitation. It's really great to be with you all today. I'm going to share a presentation that I will open up here. Great. Let me know if you cannot see that. It should be visible. So this little talk is about what we know about the designation or prescription of terrorist organizations. And let me start by putting up some headlines to sort of highlight that this is not a merely academic or theoretical topic, but rather one that appears in the news quite frequently. With this headline at the top, you see that Hamas is going on the UK's terrorist list. This just happened over the winter, and the timing was somewhat interesting. It happened right at the same time that the UK and Israel signed a major trade deal. So probably not coincidental, and gets at some of the interesting political and economic aspects of terrorist designation or terrorist lists beyond actually just terrorism directly. And we also see the headline about President Biden refusing to remove the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, from the US terrorist list, which could have implications for the Iran nuclear deal. So it's not just the terrorist lists are not only about terrorism, but they have political and diplomatic implications as well. And finally, we see that the United Nations has expressed some concern about the US listing the Houthis in Yemen, how this could impact the famine there. So a number of different aspects and dimensions of terrorist designation here in recent news, but around the world, this is really an important issue in a number of different ways. So in the next 18 minutes or so, I'm going to discuss what exactly is designation, what do I mean by that, what are some global patterns in designation across different countries, and then why do some groups get designated as terrorists, and what are the effects, what are the many effects of terrorist designation? So by designation, I'm talking about the naming of certain militant groups as terrorists, which imposes sanctions or punishments on them, their members, or supporters. And there are different types of punishments. Probably you're familiar with the material support charge, But this is a general idea of designation. It's called different terms in some different countries. In the UK, it's more often referred to as proscription or banning, and in British Commonwealth countries, UK, India, you hear the term banning or prescription more, but I'll refer to it generally as this notion of designation or listing. And in the United States, you're probably familiar with the Foreign Terrorist Organization List, which has existed since 1997. I'll discuss that more as we continue. And beyond organizations, the United States also has other lists, the specially designated terrorist list and the specially designated global terrorist list that were created in the wake of 9/11 through Executive Order 13224. And these lists involve individuals and companies, organizations associated with terrorism, and they're part of the Treasury Department's broader collection of lists of sanctions where thousands of individuals and companies have been listed. And the implications of ending up on the FTO list, I'll mention that, the specifics of that are that, number one, any material support to the organization becomes a federal crime. 5 years in prison, for example, sending money to an organization like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. There are also implications for immigration, where individuals who are identified as members of the groups can be kicked out of the country or barred entry into the United States. And additionally, funds associated with the named organization get frozen in banks and in fact are seized by Treasury. So there are a lot of implications of designation in the United States. And this broader regime, this collection of sanctions and laws on banks, new reporting requirements, a lot of this came in the wake of 2001, even though it actually began a bit before that. And globally, many countries have lists. After 9/11, the United States encouraged other countries to create similar lists. But it's not only Western countries who are involved in sanctioning terrorist organizations. China, Russia, Nigeria, many countries around the world have lists. Also, the United Nations has lists of terrorists, and other institutions like the EU do as well. And tech companies like Facebook have lists of who they consider to be terrorist organizations, because then they have a set policy, for example, saying that this organization or its representatives are not allowed to post information on this platform, or you're not allowed to use it for fundraising. And often this is to comply with local laws. So designation, it's not only a US thing, it's really global and quite consequential, as we will see. And overall, the goal, you could say the primary goal, is to reduce terrorism, to weaken these organizations so they use less terrorism. But it can also be used as a political or diplomatic tool, as we've seen in the examples with the Iran nuclear negotiations, for example. So terrorist designation is going up. This is a little snapshot of the number of terrorist groups on the US Foreign Terrorist Organization list each year. And we can see that almost every year there are more groups on the list. There were 29 when it first started in 1997. Now there are 77. Some groups do get removed from time to time, but then one or two groups get added on about each year. So, and many groups, once they're on, they stay on for quite a while. It's sticky, you could say. It's easier to get on than to leave the list. So even though some people might think of the war on terror as over, the financial war on terror seems to be more of a forever war than the military presence in Iraq or Afghanistan, for example, by the US military. That might have ended for the most part, but the financial and economic fight against terrorism certainly continues in a number of ways. And here we see some data from Taminaga, Lee, and Liu, where they say globally, of various countries with terrorist group lists, there are as many as 250 groups around the world, terrorist organizations on countries' lists, and those numbers also go up and up and up. So this is something that is increasing over time. So why do some groups get designated? There are many groups around the world using terrorism. Some of them are on terrorist lists, some of them are not. And so this was something that a co-author, Mirna Al-Masri, and I looked at in an article that came out last year. And we looked at 500 organizations that use terrorism. You could call them terrorist organizations, but more than 500 groups that potentially all could end up on a national list, like the US Foreign Terrorist Organization list. And these are groups around the world. And some ended up on terrorist lists, some did not. And we wanted to sort of try to analyze why that was. So we matched up the groups with 6 lists. The list of the European Union, India, Pakistan, Russia, the UK, and the US. So this is somewhat of a diverse set of lists, not only Western countries, it's different types of countries who might have different listing patterns or habits. So we wanted to see how this worked. And a few main findings. 2 types of groups are especially likely to end up on terrorist lists. One is Islamist groups, or more specifically Salafi jihadists, if you prefer that term. These types of groups are just especially likely. Groups with this particular motivation are especially likely to end up on lists, and that's even after taking into consideration, are they a member of the ISIS or Al-Qaeda networks, how much violence they actually use, and other factors. It seems that simply having this particular ideology is a symbol, is an indicator. Some of the groups, when they're listed, they've only carried out a little bit of violence, but we see it as this ideology is an indicator, a symbol, seen as a threat by many countries. So even though some other groups have used much more violence, it's Salafi jihadist or Islamist groups that are the most likely to get designated. And there also seems to be a diffusion effect, where groups listed by the United States are then likely to be listed by other countries and other international organizations. And this would be consistent with the idea of the United States as a hegemon, as the influential country in the world. Some people discuss, declining US influence, but certainly in this capacity, we see a strong US influence where when the US lists a group, other countries are likely to list the group the next year or a couple years later. Even countries like Russia, which you would think have quite different security interests. There's also some diffusion or overlaps among Western countries where the US, UK, and EU lists are quite similar, as you might expect, whereas India, Russia, and Pakistan are quite different. But there still is this US diffusion to most countries. And an interesting finding is that group violence is not consistently associated with listing. It's not the case that the most violent groups end up on terrorist lists. As an example, the Taliban was never put on the US Foreign Terrorist Organization list. And you might know this was because the United States and other countries wanted to eventually negotiate with the Taliban to try to end the civil war in Afghanistan, but this becomes difficult and legally complicated once the group has been designated as a foreign terrorist organization. So the Taliban was not listed, and other groups that are less violent were listed. So it's not only violence. It's not the case that the most violent groups in the world, the groups that use the most terrorism, are the ones on the terrorist list. That's part of it. Terrorism is part of it, but there are other political, for example, factors for why groups end up on terrorist lists. So once groups are on lists, what are the consequences? There are many effects, some intended, some unintended. And regarding the intended effects, some good news, you might say, is that designation sometimes reduces violence. It's sometimes associated with a reduction in violence. Of course, we might want it to always be associated with a reduction in violence or reduction in terrorism, but it's only for particular types of groups that we see violence go down. Some research that I did a few years ago showed that US foreign terrorist organizations, so groups designated by the United States that operate in countries aligned with the United States, ally countries, US partner countries, these groups are the most likely to reduce their terrorism after designation. And this seems to be because international partnerships are crucial in counterterrorism. If you want terrorism to go down, you need, and this is a group that's foreign to the United States, we need a local partner to help out. So for example, groups operating in the Philippines, like Abu Sayyaf, groups in Turkey, Western Europe, designation seems to have been fairly effective against these types of groups, and their violence generally went down after they were designated. While groups in countries not friendly with the United States, like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, like Gaddafi's Libya, like Indonesia in the early 2000s, which later started cooperating more with the United States on counterterrorism, but when it wasn't as much, we didn't see a decrease in violence at that time. So it depends on the country the group operates in. You need a local partner. Younger and nationalist groups, ethno-nationalist groups, are more likely to be affected by designation, perhaps because ethno-nationalist groups depend more on donations from abroad, from a diaspora. Younger groups might be weaker. This is some work by Best and Lahiri that discusses that. And similar with that, some work that I did with Aaron Joe and Josh Alley shows that groups, terrorist groups that depend on donations are more likely to be affected by terrorist designation. They're more likely to have their violence reduce afterwards, whereas groups that depend on crime, they're already operating through illegal financial networks. They're not depending on people to send them money via PayPal from abroad. They might increase their violence after being designated. Their violence levels might not change, but groups that depend on crime are less likely to be affected by designation. So there are also, beyond the somewhat good news of designation sometimes reducing violence, there's some bad news, some less good news about some unintended effects, some of which are quite serious, where in the Civil War context, designation seems to make negotiations less likely, at least they're more complicated, where a designated group loses legitimacy. Once a government says this is a terrorist organization, it can be hard for the government then to justify to the public, we're going to give some concessions, we're going to make them a legal political party, we're going to sit down at the table with them. Negotiations become more complicated for this reason. Also, third-party mediators might be prohibited legally from working with designated organizations. They're afraid of getting material support charged. So this can be an issue, and the implication is that the war lasts longer and longer because a negotiated end, like we saw in Colombia, it is harder to accomplish, unfortunately. And research by Sophie Haplislav, and also some work in process that I've done with Mayura Jayabraba, finds this sort of situation, where when there's a civil conflict going on, negotiations are more difficult or even impossible when the rebel group has been designated as a terrorist organization. It certainly complicates things. Also, economic development can suffer. Donors might fear, again, a material support charge, whether it's NGOs or firms or individuals sending money. Perhaps the Palestinian diaspora, the Tamil diaspora, gets quite concerned about being accused of supporting terrorism, mistakenly or otherwise. They're given to a charity. They're not quite sure who's running the charity. So people give less to charities, it seems. And this, makes a chilling effect related to charities, people who might donate to charities, and also NGOs who might operate in developing countries. And regarding, for example, with the specially designated terrorist list, individuals and firms on these lists, they can be affected permanently. There's a scholar at Edinburgh, Gavin Sullivan, who has represented some people who have attempted to get off the list, once listed individuals, and it can take years through the court process to get off the list. And even when they're off the list, it's almost impossible to get a bank account or even get a job because there are still older versions of the list floating around online, and banks and other firms are quite concerned regarding the know your customer laws. Banks don't want to do business with anyone on a terrorist list, and they should not. But if an individual gets off the list, the stigma can remain. So this can be a challenge. And getting off the list takes a while as well. And some people claim they've been mistakenly put on lists. And so there's, you might have seen some news about there were arguments about Boko Haram, where a number of individuals concerned with the economic development of Nigeria said that designation could bring about negative consequences, which could in the long run actually help Boko Haram in some ways. If you have more poorer people, they might turn to Boko Haram. So this can be complicated and difficult. in a conflict environment, especially in developing countries where the development aid is so important. So we see a lot of complicated consequences of designation, some possibly good consequences, but difficult consequences as well. And one other element is, how do groups adapt to it? One other thing I'd like to discuss is how designated terrorist organizations on the US Foreign Terrorist Organization list, for example, how do they change? How do they deal with this? Some groups lobby to get off the list. Mujahideen at Khalq, the group that targeted Iran, was on the US FTO list for quite a while. It hired high-profile lobbying firms and politicians like Rudy Giuliani to help them, and they were successful. They eventually got off the US FTO list, but it took a lot of work and a lot of money to do this. And they, of course, had stopped violence for a while as well. Some groups changed their name. Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan and other groups in Pakistan have literally changed their names. And this makes things complicated for people who want to designate them, and banks who are trying to follow the rules. The groups change their names, they break into multiple factions. And so identifying what exactly is the group can be complicated, but this is one way that groups respond. Some groups celebrate designation. They see this as a way that they've made the big times. They mention this on social media. We've been designated by the United States. We are big now. So this is an interesting response. A more complicated response is when groups turn to crime. They get fewer donations from abroad, so they start doing kidnapping and extortion more. And obviously this is consequential for the local community who might be victims of this. And we saw this with the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. They really depended on donations from Canada, the United States, Western Europe. And when it became more and more difficult to get those donations, their crime involvement increased. But we need more systematic research on these sorts of questions. Is it generally a phenomenon that groups turn to kidnapping and extortion more after they're put on a list? We're not sure, but this is something that some people are starting to look into. But I think I'm about at time there. So I'll just say thanks again so much. And I look forward to any questions and comments you might have.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm looking here and reminding everybody that please put your questions in the Q&A function. I have one here asking if the slides will be available, and if you are willing to share with them, we will shortly make them available. So that's
Sure.
Over to you.
Sure, yeah, I can do that.
While I await others to put their questions in the system, one comes to mind to me, Brian, and we've seen this in Colombia and elsewhere as groups shift their processes and their thoughts to more of what would traditionally be kind of cartel activity. And I guess, this designation really does throttle the kind of source of traditional financing. Is there any more empirical research on, what happens to the level of financing once they are designated? I mean, is there a way to draw that direct conclusion that one leads to another?
That's a really good question. I don't know of research precisely on that, but I think a number of people have looked at groups and seen similar phenomenon where how the group gets funding really matters. For example, during the Cold War, when state sponsorship was much more common, a helpful policy then was to punish state sponsors of terror. But as the Cold War ended and now there's less state sponsorship or more complicated to track state sponsorship, and at the same time globalization has made crime more possible in ways you suggest. This makes the whole sanctions regime more and more complicated to enforce, and so perhaps as a result of sanctions somewhat, or perhaps it was somewhat inevitable as well with the internet and other tools, more and these groups are increasingly turning to different ways of making money, but also sending and receiving money. So there are a series of interconnected processes happening here where technology can play a large role. but also groups adapting to laws as well. I certainly think that has happened, yes.
An excellent question from Amelie from who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And she is asking, what political goals besides ideology and diffusion is driving politicians to publicly label groups as terrorists? And when and why are they shying away from such rhetoric?
Yeah, this is a really good question. The short answer, and thank you, Emily, for the question. The short answer is I'm not really sure what the precise political goals are. We could think about domestic politics goals in terms of trying to appease certain audiences or maybe not designating certain groups. In the United States, some people have suggested that white supremacist groups are not being designated out of a fear of offending certain audiences in the United States. And I don't think it's that simple. One issue is that the foreign terrorist organization list is only for foreign actors and legally cannot be used for actors within the United States. But it is true the United States could designate more white supremacist organizations abroad, in Russia, for example. But so I think one should look at domestic politics, how the designation or non-designation of groups might be affected by domestic politics, but also with international politics, it's a way to send a message to another country like Iran. And so I think that's something that's definitely being done. It's a way also, this is important, and I'll wrap up here because I do see the other questions, but I think it's also an important mechanism to send messages of support to allies. So when the United States wants to send a message of support to Turkey, Turkey says, please designate the PKK, the United States does it. And there are other examples where countries show support to their ally by designating groups that are targeting their ally. So that happens a whole lot. But shying away from the rhetoric is something I would need to think about a bit more. I do think sometimes the reasons for designation are not discussed as much as they should be, and that's something worth more study. So thank you again.
Again, please put your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. The next one is referring to the kind of dual designation. So in the past, the US has been reluctant to designate FTO and narco, which some think is a mistake. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So there are mechanisms for designating criminal organizations. The United States has a Treasury Department has lists of criminals, and there are mechanisms for blocking the assets and seizing the assets of criminals, for example, drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. So that happens a lot. During the Trump administration, there was the suggestion from the president himself to designate Mexican criminal organizations as terrorists. This was not done. And I would agree that that's not the best way to deal with the criminal organizations who are very serious. I lived and worked in Mexico for quite a while. But calling them terrorists is I think, not accurate, not correct, and it could lead to what has already happened to some extent of trying to use, when you try to use counterterrorism or counterinsurgency tools to deal with actors who are not actually terrorists or insurgents in terms of their fundamental motivations, then this can be counterproductive and lead to unintended consequences. So I think definitely sanctions of various sorts should be used against organized crime, but not the precise counterterrorism tools, because that could not lead to the intended consequences. And we should be careful about calling one actor what it is, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I have a personal experience trying to mediate a truce with the gangs in El Salvador, which became almost impossible when the government of El Salvador designated them as a terrorist organization. It's a good segue into the next question. Do you think the discrepancies and no agreement, or the lack of agreement between the lists, might create problems? Does it stem from the fact that there is no one definition of terrorism and a big gap between academic practitioners? And also, does it imply that the matter is highly politicized?
That's a good question, Mihad. Thanks so much. I do think it is pretty politicized for reasons, we discussed how there are some political reasons for groups ending up on the lists. There is no single definition of terrorism, and it can certainly be problematic when some countries designate any opposition group, any opposition political party as a terrorist organization, or any militant group that they disagree with as a terrorist organization, while allowing other groups that use terrorism to operate. That's not ideal and complicated. And in some ways, some terrorist lists end up being lists of enemies of the state and not actors that use terrorism. And so ultimately it's problematic, but I think there is a good amount of agreement between most countries about what a terrorist organization is, but certainly there are different ideas, and states use the lists in very different ways. This is true.
The next question, again, we do have time for more questions, so if you want to enter them into the Q&A function of Zoom, that would be great. The next question is from Dr. Cengiz, who works with us at GTAC. US and EU are not always in harmony when designating terrorist organization. Hamas and Hezbollah are two examples. What do you think about its impacts when countering global terrorism?
Yeah, this is a good point, that even closely aligned countries like the US and member states of the EU have different ideas or different approaches to dealing with terrorism. Certainly we saw in the 2003 Iraq War differences among allies and how best to deal with that situation. I would argue that the EU and the US have more in common when it comes to fighting terrorism than they do, either they disagree upon. For example, with Hezbollah and Hamas, the United States might designate the groups in their entirety, while the EU designates their military wings. I think that's not a huge difference, and they end up in a similar place. Maybe it would be better. I guess it would be better for policy overall if every country was on the same page. But there are so many differences among countries and different approaches for what's the best way to deal with this particular situation. How do we approach the peace process in the Middle East? That it's unlikely that even countries as close as the US and the member states of the EU will be 100% aligned. But yes, this is an issue that is a challenge, and the countries continue to talk about the best way to deal with that. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Good question from Joshua, who thanks you for an excellent presentation. Concur. Should the U.S. Justice Department now designate domestic terrorist groups as terrorist? Would this depend on new legislation to define the statute of domestic terrorism?
I agree. This is a really good question, and thank you, Joshua. This is it's a really good point that, as I mentioned, the foreign terrorist organization list is only for groups outside the United States. It becomes really problematic for civil liberties if the government starts labeling groups, particularly politically motivated groups, because there's the possibility, as we've seen in some less democratic countries, where any opposition groups are called terrorist organizations. So this is really complicated. And there are legitimate civil liberties concerns about this. And so I think it's one thing to have a law and say that terrorism is illegal, but to apply the label of terrorist organizations to particular groups. Some people make the argument that globally and for foreign terrorist organizations it's problematic, but I think even more so for domestic organizations in a democratic country, it becomes quite complicated. There would need to be new legislation. It would be quite complicated, and so that's why it hasn't been done yet. So that's the short answer. So I don't know that the Justice Department should do it, but if they were to do it, it would be quite complicated for civil liberty reasons.
Great minds think alike. There's another question which says, should the U.S. have a domestic terrorism list, and what would the benefits and drawbacks be of such a designation? I think you've more or less answered that, unless you have anything you'd like to add.
No, thank you.
Again, from Dr. Cengiz, U.S. did not designate the Taliban to keep the negotiations open, as you have mentioned. However, we all know there were several attempts at negotiations that failed. And I can tell you from our work at GTAC that the last 4 years, the Taliban was at the top of the list in terms of terrorism, global terrorism incidents. And now they've taken over the country. So would it have given better results, or would we have generated better results had they been on the list? What do you think?
It's a really good question. Counterfactuals, hypotheticals are quite difficult. One issue about the Taliban is it's unclear how much of its money came from overseas actors who use US financial institutions, because that's really how sanctions are effective. And the Taliban with opium, for example, maybe doesn't rely on so much overseas funding. So it's possible it could have hurt the Taliban because it has received some funding from abroad, but it's unclear, since it had this strong source of domestic funding through opium production and extortion or protection of local Pashtun in particular populations. I don't think it would have had a huge effect on the organization. It could have weakened it a bit, but because of the economic resources of the group, it's not clear that it would have had a huge effect on the Taliban. But it is a good question, an interesting one to think about.
Still have time for some questions if anybody wants to add into the Q&A. I have one. We haven't really spoken about the specially designated group list. How do you see the kind of difference between the FTO list and the SDG list, and I guess the process between which one gets on, how groups get on one versus the other?
That's a really good question. So the FTO list is much more visible, and it's easily searchable. You can go online and see there are the 70 some organizations, and it makes news headlines when a group is designated. So that's how I would argue more of a political, or at least politically salient designation, while the specially designated terrorist and specially designated global terrorist lists, these are more functional designations where they don't have, for whatever reason, they don't have the visibility of being on the FTO list, but they're quite different in that they label individuals and companies, the media, some media wing of an organization, some religious organization, a charity or supposed charity associated with an organization that might be on the foreign terrorist organization list. So they're quite different in that regard. For some reason, not as visible. But if one can go online, you can see who are on these lists as well. The OFAC related lists. You can search through the many names of individuals and organizations, and it's just a massive number of entities that are designated. But it's interesting that it's a less visible and less well-known designation tool, I suppose.
Again, somebody thanks you for your great presentation. You spoke about the trends and who receives the group designation in general, but in specific, what types of groups are designated in the US and what groups are left off the list that our allies disagree with.
Okay, types of groups that are designated in the US. Well, of course, since 2001, Al-Qaeda and affiliates, and then ISIS groups and affiliates have made up the large part of the list. There have been other groups that are not Salafi jihadist on the list, like the FARC. The FARC were on the list for quite a long time, and now one of the fragmentations of the FARC have replaced the FARC on the list. So there are a variety of different types of actors on the list, but they tend to be those either in the IS or AQ networks, or it seems especially likely that groups in allied countries, Colombia, Turkey, these groups end up on the list. And groups that are left off the list, so you could think of, hypothetically, some of the groups in Syria that fought against the government that were relatively secular probably use terrorism from time to time, depending on one's definition of terrorism. So maybe in theory, those groups would belong on a list if it was a neutral list of every single terrorist organization. But I would point out that the FTO list doesn't claim to be a list of all terrorist organizations in the world. It's a list of organizations that threaten US national security. That's one of the criteria for listing. Foreign terrorist organizations who threaten US national security interests. So for that reason, there are groups around the world that use terrorism or have used some terrorism. But if the groups don't threaten US national security, or perhaps or indirectly through threatening the security of allies, those groups, even though they're probably terrorist organizations, could be defined as terrorist organizations, those groups don't get listed. So that would be one example of a type of group who doesn't get listed, groups who haven't attacked the US or our allies.
This is a good question it's actually one I was going to ask you. The Houthis in Yemen clearly meet the Department of State's legal criteria for designation as an FTO. And there's, the US removed the Houthis from the FTO list. Is some indication that the US is now starting to think through, the humanitarian criteria that these groups must either be or not be part of the list. Do you think the Houthis should be added to the FTO list, and what could some of the impacts be on the ongoing civil war?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I agree. It's really interesting. Should they be added? This is complicated. Do they threaten U.S. national security interests? That the Saudi government might say yes, but I think it's debatable. Obviously, like the Taliban, they're not seeking to travel to the United States to carry out an attack. The Taliban similarly has not sought to travel to the United States to carry out an attack. And so in that sense, the Houthis are not seen as an immediate threat to the United States, although certainly Saudi Arabia, as mentioned, is concerned with them. But certainly the negotiations with Iran have been an issue. I think the Biden administration was thinking about the possibility of a nuclear deal or other negotiations, so that became one issue. And then also, I suppose, the development concerns as well, the economic concerns in Yemen, one of the poorest countries of the world. I think the government, the administration was thinking about that as well. But it's unclear which mattered more, potential negotiations with Iran or development in Yemen. One could think about which of those matters more. But it's an interesting and important question.
Brian, not to put you on the spot, but one last question that I have is, if you control the list, who would you put on and who would you take off?
That is an interesting question. I must say I don't have a great answer to that one. That's one I would need to think about more. It's not my list, and the U.S. government is thinking about national security interests measured a number of different ways, and so that's the logic behind it. Perhaps in general there could be fewer groups on the list, and we could think about groups that are in a civil war as opposed to carrying out global terrorism. Maybe we should de-emphasize groups involved in a civil war, especially those that don't get a lot of funding from abroad, because then the designation is not going to have a huge impact on them. So I can see the logic behind, for example, the Houthis, Boko Haram, the Taliban. I can see the logic behind not designating some of those groups if the designation is not going to be very consequential, perhaps, for the groups and the intended consequences, and it could have the negative consequences of harming development in those countries, and the national security threat is not as great as it is from a group that's intent on attacking the United States domestically. Then perhaps there could be a deprioritization of those types of groups in civil wars that get a lot of funding domestically or from the region, not from the United States. Maybe there shouldn't be as much of an emphasis there, but I understand it is a complicated process, and it is a good question.
Well, Brian, we've tried to keep these sessions crisp and to the point. I would like to thank you for what I think has been an exceptional presentation. I've learned a lot, as I'm sure all of the participants have. We will, as we usually do, post this and PowerPoints if you're willing to the GTAC website. And without further ado, I'd like to thank you again and thank all of those who participated, and we can go back to our day's work. So again, once again, Brian, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you all.
Thank you.